Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I authenticate old things for a living. Manuscripts, letters, personal documents, the private written record of people who have been dead long enough to become historical. I assess whether a thing is what someone claims it is, how old it actually is, what it's worth to the market that trades in such things. I work with auction houses and private collectors, and occasionally with institutions that need an outside opinion before they commit to an acquisition. I have been doing this for 19 years, and I am unsentimental about the material, which is a requirement of the work. You cannot do this job well if you treat every document as a relic. You have to be able to handle a 500-year-old letter and think about the paper and the ink and the provenance chain before you think about the person who wrote it. I'm telling you this because my professional detachment is relevant to what happened and to how long it held and to the specific point at which it didn't. I also want to be precise about what I mean when I say frightening, because frightening is not quite the right word for what reading that document did to me, and I have been a person who cares about precise language my whole career. What it did was more like a permanent adjustment to the way I stand at the edge of the water, which I live 30 minutes from and always have. The adjustment is not fear. It is something more like honesty. The ocean was always what it is. I just know more about what that is now. Columbus knew before I did. He knew in October of 1492, and he kept it to himself for reasons that I understand better the more I sit with them. Senor Mora contacted me through a colleague in Madrid in early spring. He was careful in his email in the specific way of a collector who has learned that careful is the correct register when you are about to make a claim you cannot fully support yet. He said he had acquired a document at a Seville estate sale that appeared to be connected to Columbus's first voyage. He said appeared to be with the underline of a man who wanted to be clear. He was not yet asserting what he was implying. He asked if I would come to Seville to look at it. I flew out on a Wednesday. Senor Mora's home was in a quiet part of the city, the kind of building that has been in continuous use for long enough that the walls have opinions about it. He was a small, precise man in his 60s with the particular patience of a collector, which is a patience built on years of being wrong about things and learning to hold assessments lightly until the evidence is in. He made tea and brought the document out in an archival box, which told me immediately that he had handled it correctly, and he set it on the table between us and let me work. I spent 2 days with it. The physical assessment was the straightforward part. The paper was consistent with late 15th century Iberian manufacture, the specific laid line pattern and watermark characteristics that I know well enough to have a professional opinion on without laboratory confirmation. The ink composition, assessed through the aging patterns and the specific way the pigment had settled into the paper fibers over centuries, was consistent with the period. The binding was period appropriate. The handwriting style I cross-referenced against authenticated Columbus samples I had seen in photographs, and while I was careful in my notes to flag this, as observational rather than forensic. It was consistent. What I was looking at was a small private journal, separate from any known Columbus manuscript, written in archaic Castilian Spanish with occasional Latin phrases that appeared when the Spanish wasn't doing what he needed it to do. The register was private in a way I recognized immediately. This was not a document written for an audience, not even a small one. This was a man writing to get something out of his head and onto a page where it would take up less space. I photographed every page. I told Senior Mora I would have a translation assessment within 3 weeks. I flew home with the photographs and I set up my workspace and I started reading. I finished in 10 days because I could not put it down, which has not happened to me with a document in 19 years of this work. Columbus kept 2 logs on the first voyage. This is documented and not a matter of historical dispute. One was the accurate record. One was a falsified version he showed the crew that recorded shorter distances to keep them from understanding how far they had come from anything familiar. The crew knew about the log they were given. They did not know about the other one. What I was translating was neither of these. It was a third document, a private account that had nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with a man trying to process an experience in real time by putting it into language, which is what writing is for when it is working the way it is supposed to work. The early sections are the least extraordinary material in the document, and they are still the most interesting historical text I have ever handled professionally. Columbus, leaving the Canary Islands, the last land he would see for weeks, the ships and the crew and the weather. He writes about these things in his official log in the even, practical tone of a man documenting a professional operation. In the private account, he writes about them the way a person writes when no one is reading, which is to say, he writes about what it felt like. He writes about the water, not practically, not as a navigation surface or a weather indicator or a professional variable. He writes about the color of it and what the color implied about the depth and what the depth implied about the specific quality of the silence at night when the ship's own sounds were the only sounds in any direction as far as anything could reach. He writes about being surrounded by it with a precision that tells me he was genuinely unsettled by the surrounding in a way he was not willing to put in any official record. I marked these passages. I kept reading. Around the 3rd week of the crossing, in the document's internal dating, Columbus's writing changes. There is a gap first, several days of entries simply absent, which could mean he didn't write during that period, or that something in the document was lost to the centuries. When the writing resumes, the tone is different. I noted this in my translation file with the annotation I use when something requires extra care, significant shift, ineffective register. What I mean when I write that is that the person on the page is different than they were before the gap. Not unrecognizable, just recalibrated. He does not describe what happened during the missing days directly. He describes what he is carrying because of them, which is a different approach and a more difficult one to translate because he is circling something rather than naming it, which means the translation has to circle it too and find the English that circles in the same direction. He saw something in the water. He is not hysterical about it. He is not dramatic. He is a man who has already decided He is not going to record this in a way that could be found and misread. So he is writing around the edges of it, and the edges are enough. He writes about depth, about the difference between a place that is empty and a place that is full of things that have no occasion to register your presence. He writes about scale in a way that I had to read several times before I found the English that carried the weight of the Castilian. He writes about what it does to a person to be floating on something that goes down further than any human structure has ever gone up, and to understand for the first time with the full force of understanding, rather than merely knowing, that the distance between yourself and the bottom is occupied, has been occupied, has been in a state of continuous activity since a time that makes the entirety of human civilization look like something that happened in the last few minutes of a very long afternoon. He writes, I have seen something that I cannot put in the ship's record, not because it would make the men afraid, because it would make them understand something true that would be more difficult to carry than fear. I sat with that sentence for a while. Then I kept going. He never names what he saw. I want to be straightforward about this because the absence of a name is the thing I have been asked about most by the one person I have discussed the document with in any detail, which is Signor Mora, and my answer is the same each time. The naming does not occur anywhere in the document. I am thorough, and my translation is thorough, and there is no name. There is presence. He describes a quality in the water changing, not the surface behavior, not the color, not anything a navigator would measure or record. The quality, the way it felt to look at it. He describes the sensation of looking at something that had been in continuous operation since before human beings existed in any form, operating in accordance with conditions and purposes that had been established so long ago and so far removed from anything human that the word purpose may not apply, and that the operation was not aware of him or his ships or the small and determined project of crossing from one piece of land to another. He writes about his crew, how they did not see it. He is specific about why, and the reason he gives is not that they were unobservant or that the sea was hiding it. The reason is that they did not yet know how to look for it. The crossing was changing Columbus in real time, daily, the way long exposure to something large changes a person, and his crew had not yet been changed enough to see what he was seeing. He writes about this as a responsibility. His job for the remainder of the crossing was to keep them from learning to look, because what they found, if they learned to look, would make it harder for them to be what they needed to be, which was people who would keep the ships moving. He writes, "The ocean does not hate us. The ocean does not know us. I have been trying to decide which of these is more difficult to hold, and I believe it is the second." He writes, "A man can make peace with a thing that wishes him harm. I do not know how a man makes peace with a thing for which he does not exist." It was late when I read this. The neighborhood had gone quiet, and the only sound in my office was the heating system doing its nighttime work, and my own breathing, and the very faint mechanical sound of my laptop fan. I sat in my chair and I looked at what I had just translated, and I thought about the water 30 minutes from where I was sitting, which has been there my entire life, which was there before there were people to note that it was there, which goes down in every direction from the edge where I stand on Sunday mornings to depths that have been inhabited by things that predate the concept of being alive. I closed my laptop. I opened it 20 minutes later. There were more pages to translate, and I was a professional, and the professional did not stop working because the material was difficult. The final section of the document covers the remaining weeks of the crossing and the landfall, and it is the quietest writing in the whole account. Whatever Columbus needed to discharge by putting the middle section on paper had been discharged, and what remained was a man running 3 ships across the rest of an ocean and doing it with the specific competence of someone who has decided that what they are carrying is simply what they are carrying now, and that the work does not pause for it. He writes about the crew with a warmth that I did not expect from the historical Columbus, who does not come down to us as a particularly warm figure. He writes about their resilience and their humor and the particular human courage of continuing to do a thing when you do not fully understand why you are doing it. I found this genuinely moving in a way I did not expect to find anything in a document I was translating professionally, and I noted it in the margin of my translation file and left the note in the final report because it seemed important to the character of the writer and therefore to the document's authenticity. He describes the landfall, the moment land appeared, the crew's reaction. He does not editorialize about it. He does not describe his own interior at that moment, which is a choice, and the choice is legible. He describes the men who had stayed with him through the crossing, and he describes them with the attentiveness of someone who has been watching them carefully for weeks and who feels something about what he has watched them do. He does not tell any of them what he saw. In the final pages, he stands on land and looks back at the water. He writes that it looks the same from here as it did from the ship. He writes that he had thought it might look smaller from the shore, from solid ground, with land behind him. He writes that it does not look smaller. He writes, "I will cross it again. I have already decided. I do not know if this makes me brave or if it makes me a man who has stopped believing that his own size has anything to do with what he does with his time." The document ends. I sent Senior Mora my completed translation and authentication assessment on a Tuesday afternoon. The report was thorough and professional and recommended formal forensic assessment before any public claim was made. It covered the physical assessment, the linguistic analysis, the historical consistency, and the sections I found anomalous. I did not include in the professional report the paragraph I drafted and deleted about what the middle section had done to my own sense of the water down the road, which was not information Senior Mora needed for his authentication decision, and which I was not certain I had finished forming yet. He called the following week. He thanked me for the translation and said he had been reading it carefully and that he had a property near the coast in the south of Spain where he spent a portion of each year. He said, in a tone he was keeping deliberately light, that he had not been down to the water in the week since reading my translation, which was unusual for him. He said he had been thinking about what Columbus wrote about the crew, about keeping them from learning to look. He asked me whether I thought Columbus had described something real or whether the account was a function of the psychological pressure of the crossing, a mind under extreme stress finding presence in the void. I thought about this genuinely before I answered. I do not give professional opinions quickly, and I do not give personal ones quickly either. I said that Columbus was the most practically precise writer of his period that I had worked with, that his official logs, cross-referenced against known geography centuries later, were accurate to a degree that continued to impress historians who worked with early navigation records. A man who writes that precisely about the mundane things does not suddenly find metaphor in things that have no reality. Metaphor is the tool you reach for when the thing is real and the existing language is not enough for it. I said I thought he saw something. Senior, Mora was quiet for a moment. He said that was what he had concluded as well, and that he was still working out how to sit with it. I said I understood. I said I was working on the same thing. We ended the call professionally, and I sat in my office for a while after and thought about what Columbus wrote about the crew, about the kindness of keeping them from learning to look, about whether that kindness was available to me with respect to anyone I might have this conversation with, and whether Signor Mora, having read the translation, meant I had made the same choice about him that Columbus made about his crew, except in the wrong direction. I had not thought about this while doing the work. I thought about it afterward, and I have not found a comfortable place to put it. The formal authentication is ongoing. I have given my assessment and removed myself from the rest of the process, which is standard practice once the primary work is done. Whatever happens to the document is no longer my professional concern. I live 30 minutes from the coast. I still go. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. I have not become someone who avoids the water. I have become someone who stands at the edge of it differently than I used to, which is not the same thing, and which I think Columbus would have understood as a distinction worth making. What I know now that I did not know before Seville is not new information about the ocean. The ocean has always gone down as far as it goes down. The things in it have always been there. The particular quality that Columbus described, the continuous activity of something that has been operating since before the concept of time had anything to operate on, was present every Sunday morning when I drove to the water and stood at the edge and thought about my week. What changed is the texture of the knowing. Before the translation, I knew these things the way you know facts that you have no occasion to feel. The ocean is very old. The ocean is very deep. The things that live in the deep have been living there for spans of time that the human mind can hold as a number and not as an experience. I knew all of this, and it sat flat in my mind alongside everything else I knew, a fact among facts. Columbus stood in the middle of the Atlantic in 1492, and he knew it as an experience. He could not unknow it after that. He crossed it 4 times in his life, and every time he knew what he knew, and he went out into it anyway, which I have thought about more than almost anything else I have encountered in 19 years of professional work with documents. He wrote, "I do not know if this makes me brave, or if it makes me a man who has stopped believing that his own size has anything to do with what he does with his time." I have been standing at the water's edge with that sentence since I translated it, and I have been finding it more useful rather than less with each passing week, which is not what I expected to find in it when I first put it into English. The ocean is large. It is inhabited in ways that have been going on without reference to us since before us. When I stand at the edge on Sunday mornings, I can feel the distance from the surface to the bottom in the way Columbus described feeling it, not as a measurement, but as a physical awareness of scale, the body's honest accounting of what it is actually standing next to. This is not comfortable. I want to be accurate about that. It is not a comfortable thing to feel, but Columbus went back out into it 4 times, knowing what he knew and whatever he was when he first stood on a ship in the Atlantic and understood what he was floating on. He was also a person who looked at the size of it and decided his own size had nothing to do with the question. That is the most useful thing I have ever translated. I translated it for a private collector's authentication assessment, and I have been living with it on Sunday mornings ever since. The water goes down a long way. I stand at the edge and I let it be as far down as it actually is. Columbus knew it first and he kept it to himself, and I understand now why he kept it to himself. And I have made the same choice with most of the people I could tell, not because the information would hurt them, but because some things change the texture of how you stand at a particular edge, and that change is not something you hand to someone else without thinking carefully about whether they would choose it if they were choosing. Senior Mora read the translation and he stopped going to the water for a week. He went back. I know this because I asked him in a follow-up email and he said yes, he'd gone back, and that the house near the coast was still the house he wanted to be in. I think that's the correct answer. I think Columbus would have recognized it. You go back, you stand there, and you let it be what it is. That's the whole of it, really. That's what Columbus figured out somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic in 1492 and never put in any log. He showed another person, and that's what I figured out at my desk at 11 at night with the translation on my screen and the water 30 minutes away doing what it has always done. It's large and it does not know us. You can stand at the edge of it anyway. It turns out you can.